I want to give a big shout out to my patrons, especially my Kingsguard, which include Henrik, Brendan, Nick, Oscar, Stuart, Josephine, Ikaika, Amanda, RJ, Shad, Nicoletta, Tanner, Jennifer, Frank, Jay, Sarah, Pat, Kevin, Ryan, Michael, Terrence, Wade, Darren, FM, Derry, Boss, Mitch, Sebastian, and Benjamin. Thank you all so much. You're the best.
I consider myself to be a creature of habit. I like to stick to a schedule. My day in and day out routine does not change very much. And reading happens to be a big part of that. And a lot of people ask, like, how do you read so fast? And all these things. And really what it is I'm just consistent day in and day out. Now, the downside of having a routine and having a habit of reading is the fact that some days when you pick up a book, even if you really like the book, sometimes you're just not feeling it. And you got to push through those days. And eventually, I end up enjoying it, especially if I like the book. Now, sometimes it's just a complete slog. But I bring you all that to tell you this. Every single time I picked up The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu, I was blown away. I could not wait. It reminded me of whenever Miss Wetzel from first grade would read us stories after recess. I would always be thinking about when we'd read the next chapter, I think it's like Where the Red Fern Grows. Is that what it was? Anyways, I always looked forward to that. And I saw myself every single day just thinking, I can't wait to after work. I can't wait to after my workout, and I'm going to get to read another 100 pages of this book. So for the 4 or 5 or 6 days it took me to read these 600-some pages, I was absolutely enthralled with this. And I think a lot of it comes from the fact that this is just a good old-fashioned slow burn. And if you haven't figured it out yet, today we're going to be reviewing in a no-spoiler fashion The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu. It's a slow burn in the best way possible because it not only succeeds in being a tremendous first entry into the Dandelion Dynasty, but it also is just a great book. And that's something a lot of newer fantasy books don't have. Even some older ones, right? Daniel Abraham's one of my favorite authors, but I know his book one is a book one, meaning that it'll improve over time, but it is very much not a book that will stand alone by itself. This book, The Grace of Kings, which, by the way, Saga Press did. I love the quality of this hardback, by the way. Saga Press, I think, might be my favorite fantasy publisher when they do publish fantasy, like Brian Lee Durfee's books, for instance. But anyways, before I get too sidetracked, this book here tells a contained story that I find to be beautifully tragic. And yes, I want to know what happens next, so it succeeds in being a book one of a series in that way. But it also succeeds in just being a great fantasy book. And I'm heaping all this praise and we haven't really talked about what the book's about, but this all happens on the islands of Dara, right? And there's this massive continent and this beautiful map that's in the back of the book that I won't even try to hold up because the camera won't focus for me today. But the cool thing about the map is, one, it's really useful. You're going to need your glossary and you're going to need the map because this is a dense book in all the right ways for me. It feels very sprawling and epic, just like A Song of Ice and Fire and some of my other favorites. But the thing about the map is, it's not just a map for map's sake. I see a lot of my favorite series even. Things that are still in continuation. They have these awesome maps and all these locations, and I don't know a damn thing about any of them. In Grace of Kings, I know everything about the islands of Dar, or at least most of it. When I look at a place on the map to see a character's there, I actually know some historical context of things that have happened there in the past, and I've watched new historical events take place there as well. So these places on the map feel alive to me, which is really, really amazing. And all this story sets up in a very low fantasy, almost historical context. Think Guy Gavriel Kay type approach, in my opinion. And it's telling the passing of power, or more so the overthrowing of power. And we always talk about this. I've talked about this a million times in other book reviews, about the more important thing other than overthrowing the empire is what comes next. What are the consequences of that, and who takes over after that? This is very much about a power vacuum, about a reforming of a society and of a nation and of a continent, and all of the power struggles that come with it. A lot of books do that. I don't know if any of them do them as well as Grace of Kings, guys. Lions of Alrasan is very much that story, and I love that book, and I prefer that to this. And that's not me taking a side or me telling you that, you can't think the other way. I guess I'm just trying to put as much praise upon this as I can, because we've seen the Emperor get overthrown and then the power struggle done. But this feels like a real historical event that happened in some other world, and that's where it is fantasy, because this is low fantasy. But it's also branded as silk punk, which is a really interesting thing. And I don't know too much about it other than the fact that there's a lot of interesting technology here. And there is magic, by the way. And the magic is very subtle, and I think it plays a good role in the story without being the shining portion of it, which I actually like in my fantasy, kind of like A Song of Ice and Fire. But with this, the silk punk style and the technology, we have like kind of like hot air balloon airships. There's like anti-aircraft explosion arrows. I mean, this sounds weird, right? It's because it is. And I guess it's kind of staying away from that steampunk kind of idea, but doing it more in a different fashion. And this all being based on Chinese history. I just think that there's a lot of really neat inventions that are in this world, like literal inventions. They even have a metal detector. And I think that the magic, while low, still plays a really rich piece in the story. And then to top it all off with the fact that this is kind of reimagining of the Han Dynasty in Chinese history, one, tickles my fancy as a history fan, but also is challenging me now to want to go read more about the Han Dynasty because I don't know enough about it. And it's something I've kind of put off in all of the things that I like to investigate in history. And this being a reimagining of that has me so interested in what happened back then. Now, I will say this. I have heard that as this is a reimagining of Grace of Kings, books 2, 3, and 4 completely go a different way. So it's not just a consistent retelling or reimagining or whatever. There's a lot of original thought in here, and it's not just a simple retelling at all. And that really comes to life with the characters that are created in this world. And they're all handled from a third-person omniscient. And I know a lot of you just said, third-person omniscient. The only book I'll read that does that is Dune. Why is that? Everyone hates on third-person omniscient, I feel like. But they all love Dune. And they say, well, Dune does it, but it's kind of confusing, but it's great there. But I don't really prefer it. It seems like the more popular choice is first-person past tense or third-person limited over the shoulder. I gotta be honest. When third-person omniscient is done, especially like this, it might be my favorite perspective. And I hear the complaints of third-person omniscient being a little bit confusing because you're jumping between people's heads. Grace of Kings is going to challenge you to pay attention. You are going to have to engage with this book to get the most out of it, to feel, what I felt. And some people don't want to do that, and that's totally fine. But whenever you're paying closer attention and trying to figure out who is saying what or who's thinking what, it does make you more invested in the story. At least I think. And this is where Ken Liu does a phenomenal job of making all of his characters have distinct thoughts and voices and values. There's a lot of conflict of values here. And with that third person omniscient, it becomes kind of easy, in my opinion, as the characters get more fleshed out, because you know who's thinking what thoughts generally. Now, these characters do go over 600 pages. There are so many changes in the dynamics of not just characters, but the relationships with one another that I just think it's astounding. I really do. But that third person omniscient becomes a lot more comfortable because of the quality character work that Ken Liu has done here in Grace of Kings. And I want to hang tight here on this perspective thing for a little bit, because one of the things that you get from third-person omniscient that you do not get from third-person limited is the fact that through talking about historical context of events in this big, vast world, which really does feel like a huge continent, which is also just amazing, you get the idea that history has happened in these places, and then you get that information, and it sounds a lot less exposition-y than it does from third-person limited whenever someone says, oh, well, Jacob, you know that the War of the Thorns were... You know what I mean? Third-person omniscient, it feels like you can skip large amounts of time, that you can take some time to fill out history. And it just doesn't feel as exposition-y to me, even though in theory and technically it is. And the final piece about the third-person omniscient that I really love about the brand and the tone of Grace of Kings is the fact that not every single perspective, from a limited perspective, right, would have the same idea of what things are like. So whenever you're making metaphorical statements or similes, you don't get the option of everyone thinking alike. Now, if they're all in the same culture, technically you could, but in third-person omniscient, the gloves are off. You're allowed to do whatever you want. And there is a very natural nature feeling in Grace of Kings where the world has beauty and it matters. And Dandelion Dynasty, right, kind of gives it away. I want to read the last paragraph or two here of chapter 4. This isn't really any spoilers, but it says, he felt in a way that he could not explain, that he was meant to live more than the life he was living, destined to one day soar high into the air like these dandelion seeds, like the kite rider he had seen long ago. He was like a seed still tethered to the withered flower, just waiting for the dead air of the late summer evening to break, for the storm to begin. See what I mean? That sets a certain tone, and that omniscient narrator that we're hearing all throughout the story keeps this tone. And it just makes me feel a little bit more attached to the world for whatever reason. There are a lot of nature metaphors here, and I think the story is richer because of it, and you get away with that because of the third person omniscient and not having to worry about justifying that every perspective is thinking that way. This author has made a world that feels alive, but also he just gets human beings. I say that about Stephen King all the time. Sometimes you just get an author and you're like, they understand cognitive dissonance, they understand people being hypocrites within their own thoughts, and everything in this, the things that he tackles are really interesting. Obviously, the empire falling. He goes as far to tackle monogamy and polygamy, traditional values, also whose duty is it to serve, right? Empowering the less powered or people who are being pushed to the side and using them as a tool, and not in necessarily the most moral, I'm doing the right thing type of way, but doing it because it gives you an advantage, and then getting the power of those people. There's a lot of stuff to play here, and how the inability to adapt can actually be detrimental to your cause. And I don't want to go too much into it and talk about who's what, but you're going to have amazing characters here. You have Cooney, who I absolutely adore, has a beer belly, is kind of a fool, but is also really smart, like too cool for school type of guy, but just really nice. Kind of reminds me of Robin Hood at some portions of the story. I think that might be a fair comparison, but he becomes so much more than that. And then you have Mata, which from the get-go, I'm just trying to figure out Mata's psyche, and if I should be cheering for him, going for this type of vengeance on the Emperor, but knowing that he only wants vengeance on the Emperor so he can have that power. It's a strange dynamic with Mata and his relationship with this world that he wants to reform. Among that, there are a ton of other characters, and I actually believe that the female characters in this book were also excellent. Gia was outstanding, and I think that there is a lot of sexism in this book that is being critiqued and being tackled. I would be very shocked if someone read this book and said, I just felt like this book was just totally sexist. No, there's sexism in the book, and I do believe that it's being tackled in a very, very clever way. And kind of speaking again to characters, but also the fantastical element, there are gods in this world, and I love them. Gives me a little bit of Malazan feelings, how, the gods take on a personality of their own, and they have people who say and pray to them, but they might not even necessarily ask for it. There's a really cool dynamic there. And the human beings in the story are completely unaware that the gods are kind of playing a game in the background, and I'll leave it vague for the sake of no spoilers. But what that does, like, I will see a character do something and go, what in the world are you doing? And then you get the information that maybe a god has manipulated them. And what that does is make you inspect and judge these characters' actions with a totally different lens. And we have to really think about, well, was that their own doing, or was it the influence of the god that's in the background? And what that does is it creates a deeper level of engagement with a very, very deep cast of characters. And this is why, probably the main reason why this is just feels like a modern classic in some ways. It's just a slow burn that takes its time to do these things and set up little bitty pieces on a chessboard and make you figure it out while still being really, really digestible. Ken Liu is definitely known for all of his short stories. I think that's what most people have read by him. And I want to be clear when I say this, because writing a short story is so much different than writing a novel or a series, a book, a full-length book. It's not just writing a longer short story. I think he even said that in his interview with Bookborn, maybe. But it's one of those things where you can see that he knows when it's time to be brief and get a point across. He does it. And he can just lay a sentence, boom, and it hits you out of nowhere. And he gets every bit of mileage that he expected with that. And it really shines through the fact that he knows how to get a lot done in a little bit of page time when you're talking about the backstories that he gives characters. A lot of times he will actually introduce a character, and then you will see a backstory for them in the following chapter. But it never felt... I hate flashbacks. Like, I don't like flashbacks. You all know this, if you've been watching the channel for any amount of time. Not once in any of the characters' backstory did I roll my eyes, did I, oh God, just get through it, I want to know what happens next. No, everything felt like it mattered. And I think that's a bit of his short story strengths shining through, even though it is a totally, arguably different craft to go ahead and make a novel, and nevertheless a book one in a longer series. But I did feel that he knew when to be brief and when to be powerful. Listen, I just kind of ranted here. I'm also been under the weather, but I hope that this was a coherent review, and I hope that you have a little bit of a better idea of why I liked it so much. The flexing of the third-person omniscient perspective, also the cast of characters being so deep, along with just the passage of time being quick. There's not a lot of traveling in this book, so even though I say it's a slow burn, you're not going to be walking across a town and going to 17 taverns in this book. No, it's like, oh, we need to go get that person. The next scene, you're with that person. So a lot of the slow burn is dialogue, which I do think he does very, very well. And I'm invested in this cast of characters. By the end of the book, I felt like I was told a complete story. And that's what I really want to drive home, I guess, is the fact that this is just a great book. It's also a great book one, but it's just a great book. And it's a beautiful tragedy, and I hope that you'll pick it up and try this out, because I would love to talk about this with more people. I know that a decent amount of booktubers have read this either recently or are reading it right now. I'm hoping to maybe do a discussion with somebody. I know Bookborn is a really big fan. Her and Chris Bookish Cauldron were the ones that were like really pushing me to read this, and I'm so glad that they did. Bookborn now has a 100% batting record with me when it comes to recommendations, because, I mean, this is a top 3 book of the year easily. Easily. It would have been a top 3 book last year, and last year was one of my most stacked reading year of all time. So I will be continuing the Dandelion Dynasty. I will be continuing to gush about it. And who knows, maybe I'll reach out to Ken Liu and see if he would like to come on chatting with Nuts or something. That'd be amazing. Because I'd love to hear even more about his approach to this, switching from short fiction to longer fiction, all these things. It would just be amazing. But this book is an easy recommend. It's an easy 5-star read for myself. I hope that it is with you. It is a little bit slower, is low fantasy, but if your taste at all aligns with mine, I think that you could really get something out of this. And a lot of my patrons have also really enjoyed this. So yeah, tremendous. This is one of those times where I look at the Goodreads rating and I say it's like a 3.5 or something, and it's just mind-boggling to me. And I know 3.5 out of 5 isn't bad, but like I see other books getting like 4 and 5, and I'm just like, what? So maybe we're a niche crowd. Maybe people only like these big epic fantasies in tidbits or something. But I don't know. I love this. I wish I would have read this way sooner. I really do. I regret not reading this sooner. I really do. But that's it. I'm going to stop ranting. If you like this video, please hit like. And if you want to see more like it, you can hit subscribe. I have a Patreon in the description. It's optional, but always appreciate it. And I apologize if I sound a little weird. I'm a little under the weather. I had to force myself to get down here and film for this because I got to stay on a schedule. Like I said, creature habit. But until I see you next time, I hope you're good. I hope you're safe. Remember to always keep turning the page.